Hello, class. One of this week's lecture is on Chapter 9, which addresses stress and adaptation. And as your textbook says, the concepts of strain and stress throughout the 19th and early 20th century were thought to be the cause of ill health and mental disease. Today's lecture will address these concepts. I will begin the lecture by reviewing the term homeostasis, and then I will tell you the three main stressors, then cover the stress response, and then I will discuss adaptations to stress and disorders of the stress response. In the 1800s, it was the physiologist Claude Bernard who first coined the phrase milieu intérieur, and that basically means maintaining a stable internal environment, which is the definition of homeostasis. Homeostasis reflects the physiologic processes that oppose change. It is important to note that when we speak of maintaining a stable internal environment, we are really speaking of maintaining the volume and composition of the extracellular fluid. I'm hopeful that you remember the body fluid compartments, like intracellular and extracellular compartments, and the subcategories of the extracellular fluid, like interstitial, plasma, and transcellular. We should remember the largest of these is the intracellular compartment, followed by the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that surrounds the cells in a tissue bed, then plasma, and then the transcellular, which is the fluid that is found surrounded by epithelial tissue. For example, fluid in your synovial cavities and peritoneal cavity. The reason why Bernard focused on the extracellular fluid, most notably the plasma and interstitial fluid, is because he realized that it was the plasma that allowed the exchange between the external environment and internal environment. If you stop and think about plasma, it carries nutrients to the cells of the body, it removes waste molecules from the tissues of the body, and it transports gases. The plasma also has great ability to buffer the pH of the body. Just a small pH change can disrupt the metabolic processes of individual cells by causing proteins to denature. Of course, other factors can lead to the denaturation of proteins. For example, heat, salt, etc. Proteins are the workhorses of the cell, and the cells need to have optimal conditions in order for the proteins to play their role in the cell, so the cell may survive. Let's review some key terms from physiology. A variable is anything that can be measured. We can measure the temperature of our patient, urine output, pH, blood pressure, plasma concentration of any solute, for example, sodium or glucose. It's any component that we are monitoring. All of these components need to be maintained in an optimal range or set point. For example, your sodium plasma concentration should be maintained at about 142 milliequivalents per liter. A deviation is when the variable value migrates too far out of the acceptable range or set point. In homeostasis, when the variable deviates from set point, then there should be corrective mechanisms that can compensate. We will review the different types of compensation or corrective mechanisms on the next few slides. How much correction occurs depends on how much deviation there was in the first place. The first corrective mechanism I will review is negative feedback. This type of correction is most associated with health and most widely used to maintain homeostasis. The first component to the negative feedback loop is there must be a sensor, some way to monitor the variable. A sensor can come in many forms. It can be a neuron, or a receptor within tissues, or even an organ that can monitor a variable. During the integration stage, the signal from the sensor monitoring the variable is compared to the set point, and this forms a difference signal or deviation. This integration or difference signal can be within the sensor itself or somewhere else in the body. for example, the brain. For example, if we use temperature as an example, one region of the hypothalamus acts as the sensor and sends action potentials, input signals, to another region of the hypothalamus, which then determines the different signal, or how much the body temperature has deviated. If the posterior hypothalamus determines the different signal is beyond set point, now a correction signal, or command, is sent. This correction mechanism is a pre-programmed output response, a genetically based response. Understanding how your body, down to the cellular level, maintains homeostasis using corrective mechanisms is the basis of physiology. The output signal will target some sort of effector mechanism. The effectors of your body are cells, tissues, organs, anything that can bring about change. They include smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and glands. As a result of the effector mechanism, the variable will be returned toward set point. Are you noticing that with negative feedback mechanisms, the deviation of the variable and its correction go in opposite direction? Using temperature as an example, if you become too hot, corrective mechanisms are employed to cool you back down. One more key concept with this corrective mechanism: the greater the deviation signal, the greater the effector mechanism responds. As the variable starts to approach set point, the effector mechanism reduces in response so as to cause the least amount of overshoot. We don't want the variable to deviate in the other direction now, do we? We are never locked at our set point. Our variables in our body are constantly deviating, and our negative feedback mechanisms are constantly bringing the variables back toward their set point. Your textbook focuses on negative feedback mechanisms as if they are the sole type of corrective mechanism. True, these corrective mechanisms are dominant and associated with health, but they are not the only type of corrective mechanism. There are a few variables that are controlled through positive feedback mechanisms. Positive feedback mechanisms are used when there needs to be a quick change and amplification of the deviation. In other words, the deviation leads to correction that leads to greater deviation. Blood clotting is an example of a positive feedback mechanism. If you cut yourself, clotting factors are activated and they form fibrin threads that lead to clotting. Activated clotting factors lead to more activated clotting factors, and this leads to a larger clot. The trick with any positive feedback mechanisms is ultimately it must be stopped by a negative feedback mechanism so that the variable can return back towards set point. Using the blood clot as an example, once your wound has been sealed with a clot, the clotting factors should be returned to an inactive state so that you don't clot your entire blood volume. Our blood should normally be in a liquid state after all. There are other examples of positive feedback mechanisms, like a neuron firing an action potential, and labor. When positive feedback mechanisms are not stopped appropriately by a negative feedback mechanism, this is now considered a diseased, unstable state, and the ultimate negative feedback response will stop the positive feedback cascade: death. You can always refer to your physiology textbook if you would like to read more on positive feedback mechanisms. The concept of a stable internal environment was supported by another physiologist, Dr. Walter Cannon. He was the one that took Bernard's milieu intérieur and coined the more English-friendly term homeostasis. He proposed 4 main concepts that define homeostasis. They are listed here on the screen. I'd like to expand on bullet 3 for just a moment. More than one feedback mechanism can be employed for any particular deviation. Your body has redundancy in feedback mechanisms. Most are synergistic with each other, but there are feedback mechanisms that can also be antagonistic. A notable example of this point is the regulation of blood glucose levels. Later this semester, we will take a deep look at the hormones that regulate blood glucose levels and recognize the synergistic redundancy and the antagonistic feedback mechanisms that are employed at the same time. The second and final bullet need further discussion as well. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a steady state, which is not the same as equilibrium. An example of this is your plasma concentration for sodium. Sodium is found most abundantly outside of the cell and has low concentration in the intracellular fluid. Clearly, sodium is not at equilibrium. The high sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid is maintained through hormonal, neural, and even cellular mechanisms. For example, the sodium-potassium ATPase. Maintaining a steady state requires work, and this comes at a cellular price, namely ATP. Lastly, the self-governance means that there needs to be regulation. Again, the focus is on negative feedback corrective mechanisms. This regulation can and does occur within cells. At the tissue level, where cells can release chemical signals to adjacent cells to modify their physiology, as well as within and between organ systems. Now that we have reviewed the maintenance of a stable internal environment, let's now realize that our environment can shake up our internal environment during times of stress. Selye studied the stress and adaptation response. He was an endocrinologist in the 1930s. Through his studies on mice, he described stress as a state manifested by a specific syndrome of the body in response to any stimuli that made an intense, systematic demand on it. The mice, when stressed, displayed three key responses. They showed adrenal enlargement, thymic atrophy. The thymus matures T cells, and with atrophy comes fewer T cells released into the blood. And lastly, gastric ulcers. How can these results be explained? Let's review the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal axis, or HPA axis. This HPA axis was assumed by Selye to play a pivotal role in the stress response. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, which causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. And in turn, the adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoid. The increased activity of the adrenal gland explains the adrenal enlargement. Additionally, the adrenal gland, the medulla, would also be activated in stress with the release of epinephrine. The glucocorticoid that is released most abundantly by the zona fasciculata of the adrenal cortex is cortisol. Selye labeled the appearance of this triad of symptoms as a general adaptation syndrome, or GAS. General because the effect was a systemic reaction. Adaptive because the response was provoked by a stressor. And syndrome because the general manifestations were coordinated and dependent on each other. The GAS, or GAS, occurred in three stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. If the animal responded well to each stage, that is, the stress response, this response was considered adaptation. Adaptation is the ability to respond to challenges of physical or psychological homeostasis and return to a balanced state. Let's go through the three stages of Selye's GAS. The alarm stage initiates the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA. As a result, blood levels of epinephrine, a catecholamine, and cortisol increase. We remember from physiology that the nervous system is quicker to respond than the endocrine system, but the endocrine system provides long-term control. These two pathways are an example of two negative feedback loops working at the same time in a synergistic manner. The next stage is the resistance stage, where the body selects the most effective and cost-effective mode of defense. These means of defense can be at a cellular level, neuro, or endocrine level. Lastly, the exhaustion stage. If the stressor is still applied to the animal and the animal has depleted the resources, then signs of wear and tear appear. The animal might present with emotional disturbances. If the animal is human, they may report headaches, lack of sleep, insomnia, upset stomach, ulcers, cardiovascular damage, kidney disease, etc. What exactly is a stressor? It can be an event or some environmental stimulus or agent that initiates the stress response. These stressors can come from within the body or the external environment or both. In explaining the stress response, Selye proposed two factors that determine the nature of the stress response: the properties of the stressor and the conditioning of the person being stressed. Speaking of conditioning, one person's stress may be deemed insignificant to another person. We all perceive a stressor differently. Do you think of your gender as a stressor? Your age? It is important to realize, as future nurses or caregivers, if you aren't one already, that your patient's stressor may seem insignificant to you, but it seems very significant to them. Along this line, Selye indicated in his work that not all stress is detrimental. So he separated stressors into two broad categories: eustress or distress. Eustress is when a person perceives the stressor as an opportunity for emotional and intellectual growth and development. These stressors are brief, mild, and the person perceives the stressor as controllable. Your textbook gives examples of becoming a parent and having sleepless nights. Other examples would be you all in a class trying to earn an excellent grade so you can get into a graduate program of some sort. Other examples might be starting a new job. Yes, you need to get training for it, but you are excited about the career possibilities. You get the idea. These types of stressors are very different from stressors that cause distress. Distress arises when a person perceives the stressor as a severe, prolonged, and uncontrollable stress. Just to give you a personal example, when I was in graduate school working on my PhD, I happened to walk into the lab and notice one of our female lab technicians was cornered by one of our male lab technicians. I shouldn't tell you his name, Nick. He was physically bullying Erin, and he was yelling and pushing her. I came in and saw the panic on her face. That certainly started the alarm stage in me, and so I intervened. Nick was a very machismo kind of New York Italian guy. He did not appreciate me pushing him back and restraining him and telling him to back down. As a result, I suffered for that encounter greatly, because over the next many months, 18 of them, Nick sabotaged all of my experiments. My credibility in my graduate program was questioned, and it took me a long time to figure out that Nick was behind all of my failed experiments. In the end, I proved myself and graduated at the top of my class with honors. But that was 18 months of my life I will never get back. I'm going to give you more information on what stressors can be, both endogenous and exogenous examples. Sensory stressors are sent to the cerebral cortex through the reticular activating system. This is a system that initiates our basic survival mode. An example would be you hearing a bear starting to rip into your tent while camping. That would be an example of a sensory stressor. The feel of a shark bumping your legs would be another example. Another type of stressor can be a chemical agent that reacts with sympathetic receptors and stimulates a sympathetic response. An example of a sympathomimetic would be caffeine, and this explains why people who drink a lot of coffee feel anxious and overwhelmed, despite them trying to tell us that coffee relaxes them. Amphetamines are another example. These drugs cause changes in the body that mimic the changes provoked by a sensory stressor. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure, etc. Lastly, cognitive stressors are created in the cerebral cortex. They include psychological stressors. These are stressors you bring onto yourself. Maybe you are worried over your age and where you are in your career, or you feel like there just isn't enough time in the day. Speaking of time, have you ever stressed over not falling asleep and you roll over and look at the clock and think to yourself, okay, if I fall asleep right now, I'll have 4 hours of sleep. And then you stay awake for another hour just thinking about when you will fall asleep and how many total hours you will have in the end? Me too.